Okay, we're going to look at a few historical examples in this lecture. I'm borrowing here from Willie Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, which I think it's an academic book, but it's one of the best books that I've read on the social construction of race and Christianity's complicity in that. What Jennings argues in his book, The Christian Imagination, is that in the West, we live with a diseased social imagination. Stacey Floyd Thomas says something like this: "You cannot understand Western Christianity unless you understand Ghana." And so what they're saying is that our Christianity that we've inherited has some implicit biases, some discrimination, some prejudices, and some racist structures through how race was socially constructed. So Jennings goes on to talk about European exploration, and I'm going to combine Jennings with Christina Cleveland and some of her definitions. So European exploration and the gold standard effect. When we encounter new cultures, what we tend to do is we judge them by our own standards. You see this in our training for missions. I work for Cru, so we train a lot of missionaries to go overseas. And the thing that we talk about often, a little quip that we say, is it's not wrong, it's just different. So when you encounter other cultures, it's not like your culture. And what you tend to do is judge their culture, another culture, by your own standards. And so European exploration and the gold standard effect. We encounter new cultures, we judge them by their standards. Let me give a couple examples. These are not easy to listen to, but they're real and illustrate how this gets embedded in Western culture. Here's George Hegel, one of the preeminent philosophers that you will study in a Philosophy 101 class at any university. He's late 18th and early 19th century, and this is how he talks about Africa. Africa is the continent in which the upland principle, the principle of cultural backwardness predominates. It has no historical interests of its own and no connections whatsoever with Europe. So here you have a couple of centuries of exploration and Hegel judging Africa by European standards. You also have something like the doctrine of discovery. So Pope Alexander VI in 1493 says this, quote, "Natives' way of being on the land is inadequate by European standards." The results of this, it justifies European colonization. It justifies forced migration from Africa to the Americas and to Europe. It justifies taking resources from indigenous peoples, both in Africa and in the Americas, for the project of European civilization and Christianization. So what this does with the doctrine of discovery and what this does with European exploration, it begins to create a taxonomy of people, and it's measured by European standards. So whiteness doesn't come into play until later on, and it's a uniquely American definition. And I'm going to send to you a link of the podcast Seen on Radio, and they did a season called Seeing White. So episode 3 of this podcast, which I will link, talks about how whiteness gets embedded into American culture in the early 1600s. So you have European exceptionalism, you have the doctrine of discovery, you have Europeans judging all the peoples that they encounter by their particular standards and judging them as quote unquote less than others. You see this idea codified in all areas of society. So you have, it's codified by science, it's codified by law, it's codified by art even. All these areas, economics, and philosophy, all begin to view European, and especially European males, as the standard of an idealized humanity. I'm not gonna. I'll just refer you to the notes. There's a few quotes that I've put in there, and you can read the quotes from David Hume, Immanuel Kant, etc. I want to especially highlight a scientist named Carl Linnaeus, who's kind of known as the father of scientific racism. So he was a Swedish botanist, and so botanists create taxonomies. They study plants, different features, animals, and they create taxonomies and how to categorize those plants or animals. And Linnaeus begins to do this with human beings. It's people are being judged through these different things in their encounters with others. But Linnaeus is going to, in the 17th and 18th century, Linnaeus is going to give this these judgments as people being inferior to Europeans' scientific language. So he, in his taxonomy of human classification, he classifies 5 different human beings, and they're on a scale of value. So at the top, Linnaeus describes Europeans, and then under Europeans is Asians or Asiaticus. The third category is Americanus, and that is the indigenous peoples of North and South America, Central America as well. There's a catch-all category that he kind of calls monstrous. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's just kind of a catch-all for people that don't fit in these other 4 categories. And then at the bottom of the taxonomy is Africans or Africanus. And so Linnaeus gives language to this kind of way, this social construction of a taxonomy of human beings, of an idealized humanity as European and male, and and all other humanities measured against that. And in opposition in the binary is Africans. And so you begin to get this these 2 poles of European white and black Africans or Africans, and everybody is measured in between. So then there's this phenomenon called a middle agent minority, where they're above some and then they're below others. And you are reading in Park a little bit of that description of Korean Americans in America, and how he describes that. The other thing that I want to say quickly here is this also happens theologically. So when the first Africans are taken from the west coast of Africa to Portugal in 1490s, when they land, they are tithed to the King of Portugal in a Christian ceremony. So Christianity is embedded with this idea and this taxonomy that that puts Africans at the bottom of human classification. By the way, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just describing this. This is false. I hope you all know that, but I just want to be clear about that. The first slaves who were brought to the European or the English part of the colonies were pirated from a ship called San Juan Baptista, Saint John the Baptist. So when Africans encounter Christianity on the west coast of Africa, they're encountering it, or encounter slavery, they're encountering it with Christianity, with these Christian ceremonies, with ships that are named after saints, done in the name of Christ, done in the name of Christianizing and civilizing these different cultures. I'll let you listen to episode 3 of Seen on Radio in order to kind of get how this idea of somebody better than others gets encoded in law in the United States and begins to take root in all of our systems and structures and institutions. I want to close here with a couple of quotations and a summary. The first is from an 1883 speech by Frederick Douglass. This is when the first Civil Rights Act gets repealed by the Supreme Court, and he's given a speech after this happens. Of course, I think it's 1964, the Civil Rights Act gets re-voted on and gets reinstituted. But here's Frederick Douglass after repealing that act the first time, talking about blacks in America. We have been, as a class, grievously wounded in the house of our friends. And this wound is too deep and too painful for ordinary and measured speech. This, Douglass is describing what you're reading in Park when he defines Han. And Han is a Korean term that talks about the unresolved resentment against injustice suffered, a sense of helplessness because of the overwhelming odds against a people, a feeling of acute pain and sorrow in one's insides, the guts and the bowels, making the whole body writhe and wriggle in an obstinate urge to take revenge and to right the wrongs of all of these combined. And so what I want to do is summarize a little bit here. Our natural tendencies are towards exclusion and judgment. This is how sin takes root. Since the 15th century, this has created racial categories that idealize a certain set of human beings, Europeans, and created a value scale of worth that measured all others by European categories. This is what we mean when we say whiteness, that this is how whiteness gets created. Jesus warns against this in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. This is the do not judge passage, that you take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of another eye. In other words, self-examination and confession must come first. It also gave certain advantages to a group of people that carries forward today to what we call white privilege, quote unquote. And it disadvantages others based on the white-black binary scale. The Book of Acts is another resource, and I've been rereading the Book of Acts recently, is a narration of the call of God's people to expand their boundaries to the Gentiles, and some of the challenges that this creates because of our natural tendencies. And so we want to talk about how do we, after we've described this sociologically and historically a little bit, how do we then move from this, our tendency towards exclusion and judging others as less than ourselves, to the elevation of others, and then moving towards embrace. And you'll notice for anybody who's read Miroslav Volf that I'm using his categories. So we'll talk a little bit about embrace tomorrow. Okay?